Nick with the Flex training team here to talk about 4 common approaches to cleaning up projects in Flex. So what I'm referring to by projects is under the main menu, seeing this projects area here, we see the pull sheets, we see quotes, invoices. And so when we click on any of these pages, we can see that we have a bunch of open-ended invoices in here. And so in this instance, I'm in my test system here. I have 165 open records, some of which need to be in a closed state. And so if I narrow down my status here to my invoice paid status, ideally I would like these to be in a closed state. And so we're going to go over different methods of cleaning up these projects areas. In my first example, we're going to start with quotes. A lot of times what may happen is we start building quotes for clients, they get left in limbo. For example, if I narrow down my status here to the inquiry state, and then I organize these by my prep date column, in the ascending order, we can see that I have quotes dating back to 2022 in here, 2023. So these are all old quotes that may or may not have come to completion. In this instance, I'm going to assume that all of these inquiries, the client decided not to follow through, and so we just simply need to cancel them. So we're going to use bulk workflow in order to do that. So keep in mind that each page in here, if we look at the bottom, displays 50 records at a time. I have 81 quotes altogether in the inquiry status, and I may want to be careful where I don't want to be closing out, canceling some of the more recent quotes that I've put together, maybe from this year, 2025. And so that would be another reason to organize these in an ascending order by the prep date. So in this instance, I'm going to select all, run the bulk workflow down at the bottom here. And so this gives me all of the workflow actions that I have available from the inquiry status. Keep in mind, my workflow is very customized from the default Flex workflow. So you're going to see a lot of options in here that you may not see in yours. So in this instance, I want to use my cancel option. And then I'm going to hit OK. And that's going to run through all 50 of those quotes to set them into the canceled status. So in one of these instances, I may have a workflow state that is not in line with my status, and we'll touch on that in just a moment. So to fix that, I'm going to go to the main menu, Projects, Element Definitions, double-click on the quote, go to Search Options, and then I'm going to add the workflow state in here. And this is going to become a reference for me to use to make sure that my status aligns with my workflow state. And I'm going to move this up to be right next to the status so I could look at them together. So now that I've added that search option, I can reload that project page for the quotes. And we see these here. So I'm going to narrow down that status again to inquiry, organize the prep date in an ascending order. And so we see this very first one here does not have a workflow state. Keep in mind that this is my test system, so that could have been something I had run into at some point in my test. But it's not uncommon for us to have these out of sync, which we'll get into in just a few moments. But for now, I'm going to skip over that one. I'm going to select all except that one. And as we go down the line here, I can see the rest of them are aligned with inquiry to inquiry. And I'll use the bulk workflow to close those out by canceling. So that closed out those 49 quotes and set them in the canceled status. So if I open these back up here and show all, we now need to use the checkbox to include closed in order to see the canceled or closed quotes. And so that's what we're referring to by cleaning up these projects, is setting those older quotes into an archived state of closed. In my next example, we're going to touch on the workflow state to status mismatch. So I'm going to narrow my status to the tentative status. And in here, you'll notice that I have some that are in the tentative workflow state, as well as some that are in the inquiry state. And so what happens in this instance is if I select all and go to run my bulk workflow, I get an error that tells me that they must all be in the same workflow state. And so usually that error is what will trigger me to turn this workflow state column on in order to compare the two. So in doing so, the workflow state is what is most important here because that's where our actions originate from. So I would just simply select the three that we have here. And again, maybe these are just tentative quotes that did not complete with our client. And so we're just going to set them to cancel. I'm going to run the bulk workflow. And so we get the same inquiry actions here. So these actions are based on our inquiry state, not our tentative state. So I'm going to, again, use that cancel option. That runs through those three. And I have the three tentatives remaining. From here, I'm going to select the rest of them. And now I'll have the workflow actions from the tentative state as opposed to the inquiry state. And I'll do the same thing. I'll cancel these. Or if I wanted to, you'll notice you can also still confirm them. You can reset to inquiry. So there are other actions you can do here if you want to utilize bulk workflow in other ways. In the next example, we're going to touch on invoices that are paid and in the invoice paid status, but the status was not set to be closed. And so let's take a moment to look at the status options in system settings. From the main menu, go to System Settings and Status Options. And so in my example here, I'm going to pretend that we had completed some invoices, but our invoice paid status, the end of my workflow chain here, this did not have the closed status set to yes here. And so what that means is they were left in the open state as we saw earlier in the webinar. So if I go to the projects and invoices, and I narrow these down to invoice paid, we see 50 records of paid invoices that are not set to closed. If I include closed here down at the bottom using that parameter, we see that jumps up to 111. So I do have some invoices that were closed. Maybe these are older invoices that I had completed prior to changing that setting. So in this instance, I want to go back to the status options, find invoice paid, double click, and change that closed status to yes. In doing so, that's not going to retroactively fix these invoices. If I do a refresh or I do a full reload of the page here and narrow these back down, these are still in an open state. And so what I need to do here is reset the workflow by pushing this into a different status and then ultimately back into the invoice paid status. So we're going to go to our workflow. So main menu, projects. And before we get into the workflow, I always like to double check that I'm going to be opening the correct workflow. So if we go into element definitions and then double click on invoice, on this first tab for general settings, we can scroll down and see that we are on the invoice workflow with QuickBooks. So with that in mind, when we go to the main menu, projects, scroll all the way down to the workflow, you'll notice that I have two invoice workflow options, the standard invoice workflow as well as the invoice workflow with QuickBooks. So it's always important to make the change on the correct workflow so that you don't get yourself mixed up. So we double click. And now what I want to put in here is a reset state and a reset status. And so if we go back into status options, I may already have one of these in my system, but we'll just double check here. And we scroll down here. So I don't have a reset status in my system here. And so what I'm referring to is just simply creating a new status and naming it reset. We could, of course, utilize another status that maybe doesn't make sense for an invoice, but I just want to create one for the sake of resetting this workflow. So I'm going to create one down at the bottom left corner here. Name this reset. And in this instance, I don't care for setting any of these parameters, nor do I care for setting the color, so I'm going to leave everything as is here. And then in creating this new status, I'm prompted to permit it for the respective project elements where I want to use it. For now, I just want to simply set it as a permitted status to the invoice. Now that that's done, I can hit the plus sign down in the bottom left corner here, add a new workflow state, and I always consider it a best practice to name the workflow state respective to the status name. Sometimes, and Flex is guilty of this as well from default settings, we may have different workflow states than the status shows. The PO workflows are a good example of that. And so I always like to say that a best practice is to name them respective to each other. So I'm going to name this reset and then find that reset status. So now that we have that new status, we need a workflow action to get us into that status, and then a workflow action to get us out of it and back into that invoice paid status. So I'm going to hit that plus sign again, and this time create a new workflow action. And we'll call this reset. From the source state, we're going to go from invoice paid to the target state of reset. And then in doing so, you can set an executor group if you choose to. So if you only want administrators to be able to do this, maybe you want to include accounting or whoever else, maybe management, then you can set these, and only those security groups, only users who are assigned to those security groups will be able to trigger this action. So we got our reset action, and now lastly, we just need a way to get out of reset and then back into invoice paid. So back at that plus sign, one more new action here. And we can call this whatever we want. We can call it close invoice, we can call it mark as paid, whatever we want to do. It's simply just the name of the action. We're going to go from reset to the target state of invoice paid. Hit OK, and that's all set from here. So now with that said, we can select all, run our bulk workflow action, and we now see our reset option in here. So we hit OK. That set all 50 to that reset status, and so that disappears from here. If I go back, sorry, I actually have to reload the page because we permitted the status, but this page was already opened. And so it did not recognize that right away. So now we see that that reset status is recognized. Hit OK. So we select all, bulk workflow, mark as paid. I run through all 50 again, and now those will be in a closed state. When we set this status back to invoice paid, we still don't see anything yet. We have to use that include close parameter because now they are archived, and we can still access all of these projects, but we have to include closed here in order to pull those back up. So that cleans up our invoices so that the next time we go here, we're not going to see all of those closed projects in here. In the last example, I'm going to show you how we may run into a project element using the wrong workflow entirely. So not just wrong workflow state, but in a completely different workflow. So I'm going to open up the rental POs. So from projects, rental POs. And then I'm going to sort these to only show my status of PO tentative. And then furthermore, I'm going to set these in ascending order by the need by date. And again, that's all for the purpose of trying to address any that are in an older, maybe from a few years ago, so that we're not touching anything that is more recent in 2025 at the current year. But by all means, it's up to you as far as how far back you go. So in this instance, let's go ahead and run an attempt in here. So these are all PO tentative. Let's see what workflow actions we have to run a bulk action here. So right away, we see this error, no eligible workflow actions were found. All selected elements must be in the same workflow state. So what happens then is we get to a point of needing to sort of filter through these by trial and error. And what I mean by that is I might start clicking the three dots here to see what workflow actions are available as I scroll down here. So right away with these first two, I notice that the first one gives me submit for approval, but the second one gives me submit for approval and cancel PO. So what that tells me right away is they're on the same status. I could check the workflow state to be safe, but in this instance, I had set this up previously to know that I'm on two different workflows here. And so we're going to go back into the workflows to see which ones we need to be on. So we're going to go into the main menu, projects, workflow. And so I am working on two different workflows here. So the PO unified workflow. This is where we see that from the PO tentative status, we have the actions of submit for approval and cancel. On the PO workflow with QuickBooks, this one only has the option to submit for approval. And so right away, that tells me that those are two different workflows. I need to be setting the project element to work with either one of those in order to run a bulk workflow action. So another thing, if you're unsure, let's say, for example, this PO tentative status also had cancel, where we see the same action in both cases. Another thing that I've done just to help me sort of narrow down which workflow I'm on is create a completely new action that just doesn't belong there. I might create a new action that says something like, I don't know, test says something, doesn't belong there. And that will, of course, stand out as you go to run through your rental POs to see, okay, there's that action that I put in there that stands out. I know that that is on that particular workflow. So in this instance, again, it's a little bit of trial and error as far as seeing, which ones are on which workflow. What typically happens here is a workflow is changed at a certain point. And I would say the most common point is when you implement the QuickBooks integration. That's usually when you'll go from either the standard PO workflow or the PO unified workflow to the PO workflow with QuickBooks. And so all of the workflow, all the projects that were on those older workflows, they might get stuck in the sort of limbo status. And so what we would do in that instance is go into the main menu, projects, element definitions, rental PO, and then we would change the workflow based on which one we need to close or move forward, however we're approaching it. So we're currently on the PO workflow with QuickBooks. As a reminder, that one is the workflow with only one action available, submit for approval. And so if I go to the rental POs here, and I go to the PO that has two actions, one with submit for approval and cancel, if I try to run this action, I get this error that tells me that cancel PO was not found in the rental PO's workflow. What that's telling me is that I need to change the workflow of the element definition here to the correct workflow. So if I change it to PO unified, I can now go back here and cancel it from here. And in doing so, of course, I'd want to cancel all the ones that are in that same workflow at the same time. It comes down to usually doing a process of trial and error where I click through these just to see, there's usually going to be a certain amount. It's usually for a particular time period where I'll see, these ones are all on the same workflow. And then maybe I hit a certain month, a certain year where it transitions to the other workflow. So here's another example. And again, keep in mind, this is my test system. So I had just put some sporadic POs in here in that other workflow. But what the typical case is here is that it happened at a certain time where we can see when the change was made, run the bulk workflow for a certain amount of POs, and then change the workflow, and then run the following bulk workflow. So those are the four most common approaches that I've found in my training sessions with customers. If you have any questions or concerns, please reach out to training@flexrentalsolutions.com and we'll help you out from there.